On July 9th, 1861, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow woke up from a nap to find that his wife's dress had caught on fire. He leapt to his feet to try to assist her. He first tried to put the fire out using a rug, but he quickly determined that the rug was too small to be of any assistance, and so he began desperately using his own body to try to take the fire out. The incident was too severe for his wife to survive, and after a painful night, she ended up dying the next day. Henry himself experienced pretty severe injuries from the fire, so much so that he wasn't even able to attend his own wife's funeral. He got some severe burns on his face, which caused him to grow out a beard, which kind of became a signature for him. And it was a way for him to kind of hide the exterior reminder of his loss, the visual reminder of his loss. The death of his wife absolutely devastated him for obvious reasons. And it was something that drove him to deep despair and concern. He worried about going insane. And he begged, on a regular basis, he begged his family and friends not to send him to an asylum. He never really fully recovered from it. At one point, he described his grief as inwardly bleeding to death. Then, 2 years later, Henry was at home at the beginning of December, eating dinner, when he received word about his son, Charles. Earlier that year, Charles had joined the Union Army, and he was fighting in the Civil War. There was a recent skirmish in the Battle of the Mine Run campaign, and Charles, his son, was shot through the left shoulder. The bullet kind of came across his shoulder and traveled past his back and skimmed his spine. The surgeons said that his injuries were very serious, and even though he wasn't paralyzed at that point, there was a real fear that paralysis would soon set in. He had a lengthy recovery ahead of him. It was a few weeks later, on Christmas Day, 1863, that Henry Longfellow wrote a poem. And it's a poem that was later turned into a Christmas carol that most of us here are probably familiar with. His poem is called Christmas Bells. And I want to read it to us today, at least a portion of it. It says this: I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then from each black accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said. For hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Now I know that it's Christmas Eve, and this is a really heavy story to start with on Christmas Eve. You know, we say it's the most wonderful time of the year, and you know what? There's a lot that we can rejoice about at Christmas. There's a lot that we celebrate. There's a lot that we can smile about. There's a lot of things that we can ring Christmas bells for. But the reality is, for many people, Christmas is a difficult season of the year. For Henry Longfellow, there was a dissonance between what he was experiencing in his own personal life and what everybody else seemed to be experiencing in the world around him. He was broken, he was beat down, while others were laughing and rejoicing and Christmas bells were ringing. And I think it's the same for many of us, even here in this room at Christmas. There are times where life just seems to get the best of us. We are in despair. There is no peace. There is only turmoil. And it seems as though everybody else has Christmas bells ringing for them. This month, we have been looking at 4 different titles or names that were given to Jesus over 700 years before he was born. These names were given to him by Isaiah in a prophecy in 700 BC. And Isaiah was ministering during a time where the people that he was working with or ministering to, they were in deep despair. It was very much a time like Henry Longfellow was experiencing. Isaiah's message was like Christmas bells when the people were experiencing despair and difficulty. It was a promise that Isaiah was giving of a future ruler, a prophecy about a future hope, a future comfort, and a future peace. Isaiah prophesied this in chapter 9, verse 6. He says this, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." So what we've done over the last several weeks is we've looked at each of these different titles, and we've learned something about this promised child that was to come, Jesus. The first week we saw that he is called Wonderful Counselor. This talks about the qualifications of Jesus' ruling. We saw that he is a wonderful counselor in that he leads us out of darkness and into light. And then in the second week, we saw that he is called Mighty God, which can be translated Hero God. Jesus is our hero. He's strong. He's powerful, even to save us from ourselves. And then last week, we looked at the title Everlasting Father, speaking, of course, of Jesus' relationship with us, that he wants to be near to us and give us good gifts. Today, we're looking at the title Prince of Peace. And this title shows us the kind of society that Jesus' rule and reign will create. It's the results of his rule. Now, when you hear the word prince, you probably think of the son of a king. That's what most of us think when we hear the word prince. But prince can be used in a much more broad sense. And the word that's translated from Hebrew here is more broad. It can be translated leader, official, captain, or even warden. In fact, one of the most common ways that this word is translated in the Old Testament is commander. So in other words, this is a word for someone who's administrating or overseeing something. So Isaiah is saying that this future child will be a commander or an overseer or an administrator of peace. Not the son of peace, but one who brings peace. This promised child is going to have a rule and a reign that will bring peace to his subjects. Now, peace, of course, has to do with the absence of war, the absence of violence, and the absence of conflict. But in a Hebrew mindset, it's more than that. It has to do with prosperity and success. So the promise of Jesus, his arrival here, is that it will bring, yes, an end to wars, but more than that, it will bring a state of completeness or wholeness or satisfaction. 700 years before Jesus shows up on the scene, Isaiah promises that he will have a rule and a reign of peace. But the night that Jesus arrived, there were others who heralded his arrival as one of peace as well. It was the angels. You might remember the angels showing up to the shepherds in Luke chapter 2. The angel appears to them and tells them that the Messiah has been born in Bethlehem, and then this occurs in verse 13 and 14. Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth, peace to those on whom his favor rests." So the angels do two things. They declare God's greatness and his goodness, and then secondly, they say, peace is here. The Prince of Peace has arrived. This past Friday, I drove my son Parker to a soccer game in O'Fallon. So we drove down Interstate 64, and it was Friday. His game was right around noon, and we got caught in some traffic. The mall down there, we got caught there. We had to go to the next exit. I think it's exit 14. Now, if you've ever been at a light and you drive up to the light and it's green and it turns red, that's kind of disappointing because you want to keep going. But then what happens sometimes is the light will cycle once and you have to sit for another red light. You know what I'm talking about? That's just frustrating. At exit 14 or 12 or whatever it was that we were at, it wasn't just once and it wasn't just twice, but it was over and over and over again. Let me just have a little moment of confession, your pastor to you. There was no peace in my vehicle that day, right? The horn was getting an extra workout. The engine was revving. I was waving hands wildly, wondering why Christmas shopping, Christmas meals, kids on break, why everybody had to be in this lane at this time, at this day. There was no peace in my car. So my question is, did the angels get it wrong? Did the angels get it wrong? I mean, we look at our world today and we see the violence and the chaos and the wars and the conflict that are all around us. You look over at the Gaza Strip, this small area of land, and the intense amount of conflict that's going on right there. We look at our own country and we see the racial divide and the conflict and the tension that's present there. Some of you look at your homes, and again, Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but it has a wonderful way of bringing out the worst in people, right? I'm sure you've had conflict with your spouse, or your friends, or your families, or your kids, or all of the above. So did the angels get it wrong? What is going on? Why? It doesn't seem like there's so much peace on earth. What is it that these angels are talking about? Well, the key here is found in the last part of the verse. It says this, to those on whom his favor rests. You see, God's peace is not given to those who have good will, but to those who are recipients of God's will or favor. God's peace, the peace that's promised, the peace that Jesus brings, is not about surface issues. The peace that these angels are so excited about that they're praising God for, it's the peace that deals with the root of the problem. It's the peace that now exists between God and man. I mean, is it important that we have an end to wars? Absolutely. Is it important that we have an end in the conflict with other people or the internal conflict that we have within ourselves? Absolutely. But what the angels are so excited about is that those are secondary to the real peace that's now available, the peace between God and man. Let's go back to that title, Prince of Peace, for a second. Isaiah uses this title, and he's prophesying in 700 BC, 700 years before Jesus was born, and he's speaking to a group of people who were ruled by a wicked king. Over the last several weeks, we've been looking at this king. His name is Ahaz. Ahaz's rule was identified with pain and violence and war. Ahaz had conflict with all of the nations around him. There was absolutely no peace during his reign. And as bad as those things were, that wasn't the real problem. That wasn't really the real problem. A couple weeks ago, we had a map out. We were showing these other countries that were going to come in and attack Ahaz and all these problems. Those were major issues, but that wasn't the most significant issue for him. The real problem, the real conflict in the reign of Ahaz was the conflict that he and his people had with God. They were forsaking God, they were forsaking his laws, and they were worshiping other idols. 2 Chronicles 28 tells us about it. It says this, in his time of trouble with all these other nations, King Ahaz became even more unfaithful to the Lord. He offered sacrifices to the gods of Damascus, who had defeated him. For he thought, since the gods of the kings of Aram have helped them, I will sacrifice to them, so they will help me. But they were his downfall and the downfall of all Israel. According to the writer of Chronicles, the downfall of Ahaz and his people was not the other nations. It wasn't the fact that he was conquered by Assyria and that these other nations came in and invaded him. The downfall of Ahaz and his people was their worship of false gods. It's that they were in conflict with the Lord. I mean, did they need peace from these surrounding nations? Sure, absolutely. But the more important peace they needed was peace with God. But instead, they chose to live in conflict with him. Now, Isaiah's message to those people was that a Prince of Peace was coming. It was a reminder of his people in that day when Isaiah was prophesying that they needed to put their trust in the Lord. It was a reminder that the most important peace that they needed was peace with God. Isaiah was calling the people to turn from their idols, to turn from their wickedness, and to trust in the Lord. And today we need peace just as much as the people did that Isaiah was writing to. When we look at a world around us, again, we look at the conflict, the violence, the wars. We look at the lack of peace in our homes. We look at the situations that give us inner turmoil and grief and stress. Maybe we haven't lost a spouse in a fire that was tragic, or a son with having a bullet wound from a battle, but perhaps we have that same kind of inner turmoil that Henry Longfellow experienced. When the angels announced Jesus' arrival, they said peace had come. And church, today, real peace is not found in the absence of trouble. Real peace is found in the presence of Jesus. That's where peace is found. It's not found just when we get a peace treaty over in the Middle East. Real peace isn't found when we finally agree on how we're going to do our Christmas vacation with our family. Real peace is not found in an absence of conflict. Real peace is only found in the presence of Jesus. And that's why he came, so he could be present with us, so he could dwell among us, so he could show us a better way. Jesus came to provide us with the ultimate peace that you and I need. We need peace from the absence of war. We need peace from the conflict around us and the inner peace. But there's a greater need for peace as well. Jesus came to bring peace where we need it most, between us and God. Now, if I were to ask you today, are you at war with God? I think most of us would probably say no. I mean, there might be some people, there might be one or two people here, you were dragged here. You don't like God. You're only here to make your mom happy or a family member happy. I mean, maybe if we were to poll people in our community, there might be people who would really hate God, or maybe militant atheists or something like that. But I think most people would say that they're not at war with God. I think Christians would say that they're not. I think that general kind of good-willed people in our world would say that they're not. They may not call themselves Christians. They might believe in a God, but I don't think they would characterize their lives as being at war with God. You know, the Bible has a little bit of a different perspective on this, however. Romans 8:7 says, "The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's laws, nor can it do so." The idea, of course, is pretty clear. Those who have not given their lives over to Jesus have minds that are hostile to him, and their very way of thinking is in complete contradiction with who God is. Colossians 1 kind of repeats the same idea. It says, "Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior." You see, the truth is here for us today, all of us have been at war with God or in conflict with God, whether we like to admit it or not. And I think there's just a couple of different ways that we can be, or maybe we are right now, in conflict or at war with God. And the first is this: we're at war with God when we try to control our own lives by living in opposition to God's ways. This is sin. This is what we call sin. When we make decisions that are selfish, or decisions that put ourselves at the center. All of us have sinned. All of us have fallen short of God's standards. We are declaring war on God when we say, "My will be done," instead of saying, "Thy will be done." This is what happens when we try to control our own lives by living in opposition to God's ways. We say, I know, God, that you said that we shouldn't do this, but I'm going to take control of my life. I think I can make a better decision for myself, and I'm going to sin and ignore what your word is, and I'm going to live my own way. That puts us at war or at conflict with God, in opposition to him. We war against him when we rebel against his authority, and we choose our will over his will. But there's another way, it's more subtle, that we can be at war with God or conflict with God. And this happens when we try to control God by strict adherence to his ways, okay? Now look, nobody likes to be manipulated. Years ago, when my boys were younger, one of my boys had this great delay tactic at night. We would go try to put him to bed, and he would say, "Dad, I just want to cuddle you. Can we just cuddle for a little bit?" And as a dad, when do you not want to cuddle with your kid? When they just want to get all cozy and cuddly and lovey? You know what I mean? That is what you want. But there's also a part that resents that as a dad. Because I'm like, "Look, I want to cuddle you, buddy, but I know what you're doing, and you're trying to manipulate me. You just want to stay up an extra 5 minutes. Daddy, I just want to cuddle you, right? And you're just like, oh, okay, I'll do it anyway. Nobody likes to be manipulated. You know this whenever you have a sales pitch that's being done to you. It sounds really good, but then what do you say? What's the catch? How much is this going to cost me? What do you need from me? Because we know deep down it's too good to be true. You're manipulating me. Nobody likes to be manipulated. But some of us, we try to manipulate God in these ways. We try to manipulate God by our church attendance or by our good works, by our Bible reading or our prayer. Hey, I walked that lady across the street, so now God, you owe me. And when we do that, we put ourselves in conflict, or I would even say in stronger terms, we put ourselves at war with God. This is what happens whenever we say, God, you owe me. God, I did this, so now you deserve to do something for me. It's this thinking that says, I can control God because I was good enough, because of what I did. And so for many believers, what happens is we trust God's grace to save us. But then we get into this like works thing where we have to earn God's favor and keep his favor through our works. But church, the peace that is provided for us is so great it goes above and beyond that. The truth is we've all been at war with God in the first point, and some of us, even though we're Christians, we might be at war with God in the second point. Now at the beginning of this message, I read you this poem that Henry Longsworth wrote called Christmas Bells. But I was a little bit misleading there, so I got to apologize to you. I did not read the last stanza, because the last stanza does turn, and there's a bit of a change there. So what I want to do is I want to read the last stanza to you now. But I want to kind of start by reading and reminding you of what he said in the last stanza that I read, the second to last stanza. Remember, he said this, and in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. So he's in despair. He's at the bottom point here. There is no peace on earth. There's nothing here. But then he says this in the last stanza. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. Wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. You see, church, the promise of the Prince of Peace is not an easy life here on earth. It's not the promise that there will be no more wars or the promise that we will have no more conflicts or trials in this life. It's not that we won't experience any inner turmoil during this life. It's the promise that the hope of Christmas, the peace provided to us between God and man, is stronger, louder, and deeper than the chaos that we face. It's that the bells of Christmas will ring no matter what goes on in this world. It's that you and I can have restored relationship with God. You and I can have peace with him, though we do not deserve it, though we are rebels, though we turned our back on God, and some of us even now, we still try to manipulate God in our own way. The great good news of Christmas is that there is peace on earth for us to have restored relationship with God. It's a gift. It's freely given to us in the form of a child through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, our Savior. So how do we respond to this great news? What do we do? First, we find peace with God by accepting this gift of Jesus. If you're here today and you're far from God, you don't have a relationship here with God. Maybe you were dragged here. It's okay, all right? We love you, and I want you to know that God loves you as well. There is peace available between you and God. You might be here today, and you might be saying to yourself, man, I'm too far from God. Maybe when we had that list of those two different items, you're at war with God because you've been living your own life, your own way, and you've train wrecked it, and you've made a mess out of it, and you just feel like you're too far gone. The gift of Jesus is for you. You can find peace with God through the gift of Jesus. So accept it today. Romans 10:13 says, when you call on the name of the Lord, you will be saved. So I want to encourage you today. Accept the greatest gift ever. You know, you can get a gift on Christmas, and it can sit under the tree, but until you take it and open it and receive it and use it, it's just sitting there. And today, there is the best gift ever sitting there for you here on Christmas. And I want to encourage you to accept it today. For those of you who are in the room who are believers, there's another response for us as well. And that's for us to declare God's greatness and to tell others about the gift of Jesus. You know, when those angels showed up to those shepherds, what did they do? They declared God's greatness and his goodness. Look at what God has done. He's amazing, and now there's peace available to you. And the shepherds, well, I didn't read it, but you can read it there in Luke, just a few verses later. What do? They go see this gift, they experience the gift, and what do we find? We are told that they went and then told everybody about the arrival of Jesus. Christian, if you're here today and you've already accepted the gift, you've already made it through the first response there on the screen, if you've already done that, then your responsibility then, being recipients of that gift, is to then go and to share that gift with others. Because you know as well as I do that our world is filled with people who are not at peace with God, and they desperately need that hope. They desperately need that peace. So if you're here today and you're not a believer, you're far from God, in just a minute, I'm going to ask you just to raise your hand. I'm going to pray a prayer, and then I'm going to ask you to keep your eyes closed. And if you're here and you want to respond, you're thinking, man, I need to have peace with God. I want to accept that gift. All I'm going to do is ask you to raise your hand, and I'm going to pray for you. And then if you're here today and you're a believer, can I challenge you this Christmas season to be like the angels, to be like the shepherds, to go and declare God's greatness. What has he done in your life? What has he done in your life? And then go share that peace with others, that they too can enter into a relationship with God. Let's pray.